Jamestown and New England Communism. Today we're going to be looking at a historical example of a system of communal ownership of property called communism. Now, this is not the official capital C communism associated with Karl Marx and maybe the more recent Soviet Union, but rather this is a this is a system that's been tried in the sense of people owning property together in common. It's as it's mentions in the writings of Plato, the philosopher. It's been tried by different societies throughout history. And the idea is this kind of common survival. And we're going to look at two examples of this, which were tried in Jamestown, early America, first permanent British colony, and then in New England. We think of the Puritans, the Pilgrims, people who came over on the Mayflower and established Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony, and why these two pretty different groups, one being more religious, one being more secular, one leaving for religious reasons, one leaving for more company reasons, Virginia company reasons, both one having a form of bondage and slavery, one having more of a freer system in terms of bondage and indentured servanthood and things of that nature, one in the North and one in the South. Now, we're going to talk through why these systems failed and why they abandoned them, why they didn't end up working. Before I do that, I want to recommend an article or an essay, a kind of famous essay in economics called I, Pencil. It's written by this author, Leonard Read, several years ago, and it's a great reading to demonstrate just the complexity and the beauty that's built into just simple everyday things. There's nothing out of the ordinary about a pencil, but what is amazing about it is he says, he speaks in writing this essay kind of an imaginary, creative way about being the lead pencil, and he says, I am the lead pencil, the ordinary wooden pencil familiar to all boys and girls and adults who can read and write. I am seemingly so simple, yet not a single person on the face of this earth knows how to make me. And that's a pretty bold claim, something as simple as a pencil. And he's not saying that nobody knows how to put a pencil together. But what he's saying is the knowledge and resources to create a pencil are dispersed very broadly. And every person who participates in that process, whether knowingly or unknowingly, contributes a very tiny part of an overall process that makes pencils. And a single individual on Earth trying to go by themselves, creating this pencil, taking the wood, the graphite, the metal for the band, the rubber, finding all these things, bringing the materials together, assembling them. It would create, it would take and require thousands, unknown amounts of time also to create just one pencil. And yet we have pencils as kind of like a norm of our society. They're a normal, ordinary item. And the point of iPencil is that no one really knows how pencils are produced, not because there's some sort of like moral ignorance, but because knowledge is spread out and dispersed, and things are spread out and dispersed so far and so broadly that no single individual working on his own could produce these things. Now, people interacting freely together, though, can combine the benefits of their knowledge, can work for their own ends, and through this network of interaction and free association, these things get produced. So the person cutting down the trees, their goal is to get a paycheck that allows them to buy what they want. But the trees may be used in pencils and lumber for houses and all sorts of different things that are a network of interactions that are millions of known and unknown interactions that are happening that come together to produce all the things in our modern world. The most simple of objects takes a huge amount of resources to be able to produce and knowledge. And that's why we're going to see ultimately the communism of Jamestown and the communism of New England failed, and they abandoned it because the knowledge was too dispersed, even in those small communities, for people to know what the needs of individuals were. Plus, people were no longer working toward their own ends. They were either working for the community or, in the Virginia case, the company. And so these things failed to produce the results that were intended. I recommend the video the iPencil movie. It's a short video that explains this process in a creative way in a few minutes. So Jamestown, Jamestown from early studies of American history, and it's very small. Here's a depiction of it, artist depiction of what Jamestown looked like. It was more of a fort. It was produced by the Virginia Company, and a lot of the people working there were indentured servants, meaning an indenture was a contract of sorts that was signed for usually 4 to 7 years. Now, some people did sign up in order to get out of England and go toward the New World, where they hoped to get land, possibly gain wealth, and opportunities that wouldn't have been available to them back in England. However, a lot of these indentured servants were captured. Some of them were prisoners. Some of them were poor Irish or English people who were captured at young ages, or captured or in debt slavery, and so they were sold into indentured servanthood, which meant that they were working not for themselves, but they were unfree labor. So it's a form of slavery. They were taken to Jamestown and other locations and forced to labor. Now, the indenture wasn't meant to be a permanent form of slavery. It was on average about 4 to 7 years. The catch was, in Jamestown especially, the average survival rate was about 2 to 3 years. So a lot cheaper in economic terms to hire indentured servants. This is why African slavery, being too expensive during this time, didn't take off yet. So the indentured servants, if you purchased an indentured servant, they worked for a couple years, and then you didn't have to give the payout at the end of land, of seed, of some seed for growing crops, some tools. That was a better cost benefit than African slavery. So anyway, this is where a lot of the labor system of Jamestown is coming from. Now, Jamestown, the colonists began with a system of communal ownership of land and property. Now, that some people make a differentiation between personal property and private property. They'd say private property is stuff like land and resources, and personal property is something like a toothbrush. So they'd say, okay, well, it's not that everybody owns your toothbrush. You can have personal property, but you can't have private property. The resources, the land belongs to everybody. Because we all use it, we all need it. Okay, so the colonists began with a system of communal ownership of land and property. Most of the colonists during this time, and correlated to this system, uh, but not alone, died of starvation and disease. Now, these are called the starving times. So there's lack of food, there's lack of resources. A lot of people came expecting to find gold, bringing tests for gold and tools for digging for gold. And when they got there and discovered they had to farm, they uh, were not willing really to engage in that type of labor and weren't used to that type of labor. Also, there was contamination of water, latrines, toilets dug too close to the James River and the water supply, and those different things that caused tons of diseases. And so the small amount of colonists who went to Jamestown in the first place, one, did not bring down the so-called overpopulation of Britain during the time because only a few people went. And it's kind of a failure at the beginning, especially because most of them die of starvation and disease. They also, all their labor is going to the Virginia Company, and they have no benefits in the system. So within 6 months, 38 of the original 104 settlers had died from famine. 2 years later, in 1609, the Virginia Company sent 500 more recruits, but within 6 months, 440 of them had died. Now, John Smith, who's known from the Pocahontas movie probably, but was the captain during this time, and a lot different in actual history than in popular depiction. But he recognizes this problem in Jamestown, but doesn't identify the root cause of it. He recognizes that even though people are starving, that even though people are very desperate, as we're going to see some examples, that people under this system were unwilling to work. So people under the system in which they were operating were unwilling to work. And they were unwilling to work for many causes, but, and this goes into another topic, the economics of slavery itself. When you invest in capital goods, tools, like think like a lawnmower, that has costs. You have to buy the materials, you have to buy the original lawnmower, you have to buy the gas and oil and things to maintain it. You have to maybe do repairs. And then every time you use the lawnmower, you're moving toward, however long it takes, but you're moving toward having to need a new lawnmower. So the value of the lawnmower is what it's able to produce. How many lawns can you get mowed, as opposed to if you didn't have the lawnmower, minus the costs of the upkeep. But the problem with the economics of slavery is when people are being taken in bondage and forced to work and not receiving the benefits of their labor freely, what ends up happening is you have all those costs like you would for investing in capital labor, but you've invested in a human being who's being forced to labor. So that comes with management costs and enforcement costs, as well as other subsistence and upkeep costs that you would have to pay for if you invested in capital goods like a machine. You're investing in a person, but enslaving them, so you have to manage, train, and enforce the system against them, which does not give them incentive to work. Plus, when people did work, they received no benefit for the fruit of their labor. And so their incentive was kind of a race to the bottom. Their reasoning was, their motive was to do the least amount of work possible. And so John Smith said, "Countrymen, the long experience of our late miseries, I hope, is sufficient to persuade everyone to a present correction of himself. And think not that either my pains nor the adventurers' purses will ever maintain you in idleness and sloth. The greater part must be more industrious or starve. You must obey this now for a law, that he that will not work shall not eat, except by sickness he be disabled. for labors of 30 or 40 honest and industrious men shall not be consumed to maintain 150 idle loiterers. Now, John Smith has a point here that what ends up happening is the people who are producing the most work, that other people are kind of free riding on the benefits of that. But he's not identifying why this is taking place, that this communal ownership of property and this slavery and indentured servanthood warping the incentives of people to work, plus the fact that people receive no benefit from their work. Everything surplus goes to the Virginia Company. People are just at the level of bare subsistence. They have no personal freedom to branch out and to provide uh, other goods and services that they see people making money and therefore people there's a higher demand for, and then receiving benefits and money from that to trade for the things that they want. So what John Smith brings in is he does bring in a principle that in and of itself is true, but it's true with regard to a system that people are free to operate and work, and receive the benefits of their labor. Now, in Jamestown, there is also historical and even some, I want to be careful, some scientific evidence of cannibalism. Now, we're looking at archaeology that's 400 years old, so we don't want to extrapolate too much from that. But there is some evidence of cannibalism from a forensic perspective. But also, it's written about during this time. They said, so great, one person writing during this time said, so great was our famine that a savage we slew and buried, the poorer sort took him up again to eat him, and eat him. So did the diverse ones one another boiled and stewed with roots and herbs. And so it shows the desperation of this time. There was some sort of fight with one of the American Indians in the region, that this person had died and was buried, and someone was desperate enough to try to dig this individual up and eat the body. People were reported to eat boots, leather, horses, and one person was even burned at the stake for murdering his pregnant wife with the plan to eat her. So this is a very desperate time. But no matter how high the level of desperation got, the labor system was so inefficient and so detrimental to the incentive to work that people avoided work at all costs, because there was no connection between work and what the person was receiving. And so when that connection is severed, the system falls into pretty much chaos, pretty much starvation, loss, want, and a very harsh system enforcing it, and yet people still unwilling to work. The Virginia Company were indentured servants, as I mentioned, who had no financial stake in the fruit of their labor, and they owned no property. So the laborers could not own any property, and they likely died before they had the chance to get any property cases. Working harder provided no benefit whatsoever. And so all the profits, all the benefits, all the labor produced went to the Virginia Company. And then the Virginia Company had a common store, not like a shopping store, but a common warehouse, in a sense, where they would dole out subsistence, food, clothing, shelter to these individuals. So even though most settlers had starved, the remaining people were spending much of their time playing games in the streets. So this is a tax 100% on their labor. That's what slavery is. It's a 100% tax on the labor of these individuals. And so it led to huge economic problems. Now, later on, others discovered kind of this problem and moved steps sort of in the right direction. Not totally, but it did change, and Jamestown did become more successful. In 1611, just a few years later, Sir Thomas Dale sent was sent to act as the High Marshal of the Virginia colony, and he organized a different system. He recognized the problems of the communal ownership of property. So each man in the colony would be given 3 acres of land. Now people had their own private property, they had land. Each man was required to work no more than 1 month a year to contribute to the colony treasury. So there was still a tax, but it was a tax of 1 month's income, if you will, uh, of the year. The other 11 months, people could do what they wanted, and that 1 month would have to be devoted to the colony treasury. So the farmers would be required to pay one lump sum tax of 2.5 barrels of corn. So they had to grow at least 2.5 barrels of corn. They would pay that tax in a one-time lump sum, and then they could do whatever they wanted as far as the rest of the year was concerned. With private property, the colony began to prosper and grow, and the individual now had an incentive to increase effort because he benefited from the fruit of his own labor. Now, there were still a lot of problems in Jamestown, but this started to ease up on the system. People also started to grow. So now think about the fact that these are called the starving time. Well, people started to grow tobacco. Well, you can't eat tobacco. I mean, I guess you could. It's in the vegetable category, right, officially, but I don't know if you can survive off of it. But it's not meant to eat. So people started growing tobacco. John Rolfe, who actually married Pocahontas, brought tobacco seeds, it's not exactly clear from where, to the colonies. Spain was in the tobacco trade. They had the kind of secret recipe of growing tobacco in their colonies down in South and Latin America. And they had the death penalty for anybody who gave the seeds of that tobacco to foreigners. Somehow, John Rolfe got a hold of these seeds, brought them to Virginia, and started planting tobacco there. And Virginia was a very good environment for the growing of tobacco. But it's kind of a conundrum here. You can't eat tobacco, so why did the colonists start growing so much of it? And why does tobacco become this huge industry? And Jamestown doesn't get worse, it actually gets better. The more tobacco they grow, a lot of people stop growing food. A lot of people stop growing wheat and grain and corn. They switch almost exclusively to tobacco. Well, how are they able to do this? Well, they're able to do this because of an economic concept called the division of labor, which is what I was talking about earlier in the pencil. There's what we experience now are the benefits of an international division of labor, that a job is dispersed and spread out into so many smaller uh, parts of that uh, overall task that it becomes easier to do and do and do more of, and people specialize what they're good at or skilled at or have the tools for, and then they trade and interact, and everybody's standard of living goes up. And this is what happened with tobacco as well. The colonists started growing tobacco, trading it with Europe, using it as money, and in many cases, and also trading for the things that they wanted. So there was a transition from the times of starving to relative prosperity that continued to increase. As soon as the settlers were thrown upon their own resources, each freeman had acquired the right of owning property. The colonists quickly developed what became the distinguishing characteristic of Americans, an aptitude for all kinds of craftsmanship, coupled with an innate genius for experimentation and innovation. So this discusses that after their was the abandonment of this communal ownership of property in Jamestown. People were thrown on their own resources. It doesn't mean that they're independent or don't need anybody else or don't depend on anybody else in that literal sense. It's that they depend on each other even more. But the freedom allows them to choose their own path and allow others to do the same and then interact and trade through that division of labor. And everybody benefits from that. There aren't net losers from that. Now let's go to the north a few years later, the Plymouth colony. This is a little bit more familiar, I believe, because of the post-Civil War. There was more of a focus on the north than on the original colony in Jamestown in the south in Virginia. But Plymouth is the story. There's the Charlie Brown, Thanksgiving special. There's the Mayflower, and stories that people are a little bit more familiar with. So the Mayflower landed at Plymouth in 1620, mid-December 1620. And like Virginia, half of the colonists had died by the end of the first winter. Sickness, disease, starvation, lack of sanitary conditions, lack of housing, the elements, but also one of the major reasons of the hardships for the time, that if not creating the problems in totality, for sure, places an extra amount of burdens on the settlement, was their communism, the communal ownership of property. By 1623, they changed this. Within 3 years, each family could own a small private lot for their own use. So they abandoned this rather quickly after they recognized it didn't work. Here's the Mayflower passengers who were alive at the time, and then the Mayflower passengers who were alive by the first Thanksgiving in 1621, a year later. William Bradford said, and I've reworded this just because the language is a little bit hard to understand in kind of an older English format, but he says the experience was had in this common course and condition tried sundry years, and that amongst godly and sober men may well evince the vanity and conceit of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of later time, that the taking away of property and bringing into community, bringing in community into commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. Now, what he's saying there is, he says, many times throughout history, this system of communal ownership of property has been tried. And he even recognizes Plato and other philosophers talked about it in a theoretical sense, in their ideal world that they created in their minds. But he says, so we tried it, the taking away of property, bringing all the community into commonwealth. And they did this because they were Christians. They wanted to help each other. They wanted everybody to survive. He said, okay, well, let's do this. This is in the Bible in the sense that they mention a specific time and circumstance of doing this in the early church in Acts. Let's all live with communal ownership of property. But he said this was trying to be as if they were wiser than God. He calls this the conceit of Plato, in the sense that people can imagine that this thing works in a theoretical world. And often people say, well, this could work on paper. But even that is highly debatable, because he says that when this is actually applied, there's lack of knowledge, of the knowledge of individual circumstances, which people can only know for themselves. There's lack of people value different things for different reasons. There's lack of incentive to work. There's all sorts of problems here that take place. He points out one, he says, for the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine, that they should spend their time and strength for other men's wives and children without any recompense. In other words, the young men at this time who could produce the most labor were starting to complain that they're not receiving any of the benefits of their labor. Now they're receiving some of the benefits in the sense that everybody's getting subsistence and everybody's trying to survive. But when people feel like that they're working for other people's wives, other people's children, and they're not receiving their own benefits and then just being able to decide freely what they want to do with those resources, they feel stuck. They feel disincentivized to work. And so William Bradford said, I answer, seeing all men have this corruption in them, God in his wisdom saw another course fitter for them. See, if we recognize, now this goes into philosophy, not economics, but if we recognize human fallibility or human corruption on any level, the idea that humans ought to be yoked in common together is going to run into some pretty serious problems. Now, Bradford's view that you don't have to adopt, but Bradford's view was that God saw in his wisdom a fitter course, that people as individuals would have to toil and receive the fruits of their free labor. New economic view of American history, these authors explain the American economy was at least 10 times larger in 1775 than it had been in 1690, and 100 times larger than in the 1630s. So from the time of the 1630s to the time of 1775, the American economy that had switched largely to a system of free labor. Now, unfortunately, they still had indentured servanthood, they still had slavery, and there's going to be an obvious participation in the Atlantic slave trade, which is going to bring in slavery into the United States. But even that, which I talk about economics of slavery in another place, but even those errors, those ethical mistakes, and those economic drags, the U.S. economy was able to grow by 100-fold from 1630 to 1775 by the time of the American Revolution. Now, some people will argue, well, that's because of slavery. It can't be, because there's always been economic exploitation throughout history. There's always been slavery throughout history, and it's never produced anything like the economic growth or economic wealth that we see growing out of these times. Also, there are several other reasons for why free labor is an economic competitor to slavery, why it's much more productive, much more efficient, and it's more ethical in the sense that it is not trading in bondage. But that's a topic for another time. Point is, the systems of communal ownership of property, in a sense, were largely abandoned early on in American history because they recognized the problems even within very small communities. And this allowed the economy to continue to grow, and it would even continue to grow even more dramatically after 1775 from the 1800s until present day. That's when the greatest amount of growth happened.